Sarah Martinez clutched her worn leather briefcase as she walked through the bustling halls of the Pentagon. Her military uniform was crisp, her posture straight, but inside she felt the weight of suspicion that had followed her for weeks. As a military intelligence analyst specializing in Middle Eastern operations, she had uncovered something that made her superiors uncomfortable. 3 months earlier, Sarah had been analyzing communication patterns from a suspected terrorist cell in Syria when she noticed something odd. The intel didn't match the official reports coming from field operatives. According to her analysis, the coordinates being targeted in upcoming drone strikes were civilian areas, not terrorist strongholds as claimed. When she tried to raise concerns through proper channels, her reports were dismissed and eventually buried. The morning started like any other, but Sarah sensed something different in the air. Her colleagues avoided eye contact and hushed conversations stopped when she entered rooms. Colonel Davidson, her direct supervisor, had been particularly cold toward her lately. She knew her persistent questions about the Syria intelligence had made her unpopular, but she never expected what was about to unfold. During the weekly intelligence briefing, Sarah presented her findings about discrepancies in the Syrian operation reports. She had spent countless hours cross-referencing satellite imagery, communication intercepts, and human intelligence sources. Her conclusion was troubling. Someone was deliberately providing false coordinates, potentially leading to civilian casualties while allowing real targets to escape. Colonel Davidson's face darkened as Sarah spoke. Other officers in the room shifted uncomfortably in their seats. When she finished her presentation, the room fell silent. Davidson stood up slowly, his jaw clenched tight. He accused her of undermining military operations and questioned her loyalty to the country she had served faithfully for 8 years. Sarah felt her heart racing as Davidson continued his verbal assault. He suggested that her analysis was flawed, her methods questionable, and her motives suspicious. Other officers nodded in agreement, though Sarah noticed some looked uncomfortable with the harsh treatment she was receiving. She tried to defend her work, explaining her methodology and showing the evidence she had gathered. The situation escalated quickly when Davidson announced that Sarah's security clearance was being suspended pending a full investigation into her conduct. He accused her of potentially compromising national security by questioning established intelligence protocols. The room buzzed with whispered conversations as Sarah stood frozen, unable to believe what was happening. As security personnel approached her desk later that morning, Sarah realized the gravity of her situation. Her computer access was revoked, her files confiscated, and she was escorted from the building like a common criminal. Colleagues she had worked with for years looked away as she passed, some whispering behind her back. The woman who had dedicated her career to protecting her country was now being treated as a threat. Outside the Pentagon, Sarah sat in her car, hands shaking as she tried to process what had just occurred. Her phone buzzed with messages from concerned friends and family who had heard rumors about her situation. She knew that news of her suspension would spread quickly through military channels, potentially destroying her reputation and career forever. That evening, Sarah reviewed the evidence she had secretly copied to a personal drive before her suspension. The more she studied the data, the more convinced she became that something sinister was happening. The pattern of misinformation wasn't random. It was deliberate and coordinated. Someone with high-level access was manipulating intelligence reports, and when she tried to expose it, she became the target instead of being thanked for her diligence. The investigation into Sarah's conduct began immediately, led by internal affairs and military security personnel. Her home was searched, her personal communications monitored, and her financial records scrutinized for any sign of foreign influence or bribery. The investigators seemed determined to find evidence of wrongdoing, no matter how flimsy. Sarah hired a military defense attorney, but even he seemed skeptical of her claims. The evidence she presented about intelligence manipulation was dismissed as the desperate attempts of someone trying to cover up their own misconduct. Her attorney advised her to accept responsibility and seek a plea agreement, but Sarah refused to admit to crimes she hadn't committed. Media attention began to focus on the case when details leaked to defense reporters. Headlines painted Sarah as a rogue analyst who had potentially compromised sensitive operations. Anonymous sources within the Pentagon provided quotes suggesting she was unreliable, possibly mentally unstable, and certainly unfit for her position. The character assassination was swift and thorough. Sarah's family faced harassment as reporters camped outside their home. Her elderly parents, both veterans themselves, couldn't understand how their daughter had become the target of such accusations. Her younger brother, currently serving in Afghanistan, called to express his confusion and concern about the situation affecting the entire family. During formal questioning sessions, investigators pressed Sarah about her contacts with foreign nationals, her travel history, and any unusual financial transactions. They seemed particularly interested in a conference she had attended in Jordan 2 years earlier, where she had presented research on regional security threats. Every aspect of her professional and personal life was examined under a microscope. The psychological pressure mounted as Sarah found herself isolated from former colleagues and friends. Many people she had trusted for years now viewed her with suspicion or avoided her altogether. The military community, which had been her second family, now treated her like an outsider and potential traitor. Sarah's security clearance remained suspended, making it impossible for her to work in her field or even defend herself with classified materials that could prove her innocence. She was caught in a bureaucratic trap where the very evidence needed to clear her name was classified beyond her reach. Her savings dwindled as legal fees mounted and job opportunities disappeared. Colonel Davidson appeared frequently on military news programs, speaking about the importance of trust and loyalty in intelligence work. Without mentioning Sarah by name, he made it clear that individuals who undermined established protocols posed serious threats to national security. His comments were widely interpreted as directed at Sarah's case. Anonymous threats began appearing in Sarah's email and social media accounts. Some messages suggested she should leave the country while she still could, while others made more direct threats against her safety. The FBI was notified, but the investigation into these threats seemed to receive minimal attention compared to the case against her. 3 weeks into the investigation, Sarah received notice that formal charges were being prepared against her. The charges included violations of military protocol, unauthorized disclosure of classified information, and conduct unbecoming an officer. Each charge carried potential prison time and would end her military career permanently. The woman who had tried to prevent civilian casualties now faced the possibility of being branded a traitor and spending years behind bars. The court-martial proceedings began on a cold Monday morning in November. Sarah sat at the defense table in her dress uniform, stripped of the decorations she had earned through years of faithful service. The military courthouse was packed with reporters, fellow officers, and curious observers who wanted to witness the downfall of the woman branded as a military fraud. The prosecution painted Sarah as an unstable officer who had fabricated evidence to cover up her own analytical mistakes. They argued that when her flawed work was questioned, she created an elaborate conspiracy theory to deflect blame. Expert witnesses testified about the dangers of rogue intelligence, analysts, and the importance of maintaining strict protocols in military operations. Sarah's defense attorney struggled to present her case without access to classified materials that could support her claims. The few witnesses willing to testify on her behalf were quickly discredited by prosecution cross-examination. The military justice system seemed designed to ensure her conviction rather than uncover the truth about her allegations. During her testimony, Sarah spoke passionately about her discovery of the intelligence discrepancies and her attempts to report them through proper channels. She described the pattern of false information she had identified and her growing concern about potential civilian casualties. However, without access to the classified evidence, her words seemed hollow and desperate. The prosecution's star witness was Colonel Davidson, who testified about Sarah's erratic behavior and unreliable work performance. He described her as someone who had become obsessed with conspiracy theories and unable to accept criticism of her analytical methods. His testimony was compelling and seemed to convince many observers in the courtroom. As the trial progressed, Sarah noticed odd details that troubled her. Some of the prosecution's evidence seemed too perfectly organized, as if it had been prepared well before her investigation began. Phone records and email logs appeared to have gaps during crucial time periods. Her attorney pointed out these inconsistencies, but they were dismissed as normal administrative variations. Sarah's former colleagues were called to testify about her character and work performance. Most gave neutral or slightly negative assessments, clearly reluctant to be associated with someone facing such serious charges. A few brave individuals spoke positively about her dedication and analytical skills, but their testimony carried little weight against the prosecution's narrative. The media coverage of the trial was uniformly negative toward Sarah. Military analysts on television programs discussed the case as an example of how even trusted personnel could become security risks. Editorial writers called for stronger vetting procedures and more aggressive monitoring of intelligence personnel to prevent similar cases in the future. Sarah's parents attended every day of the trial, sitting in the gallery and watching their daughter's reputation being systematically destroyed. Her father, a decorated Vietnam veteran, struggled to understand how the military he had served with pride could turn so viciously against someone trying to do the right thing. Her mother wept quietly as witness after witness testified against her daughter. During cross-examination, Sarah's attorney tried to establish that the intelligence discrepancies she had reported were real and significant. However, the prosecution successfully argued that discussing such details would compromise ongoing operations. The judge ruled that much of the defense's planned evidence would remain classified and could not be presented to the court. As the prosecution rested its case, Sarah felt completely isolated and defeated. The evidence against her seemed overwhelming, and the military justice system appeared determined to make an example of her. Her attorney prepared her for the likelihood of conviction on multiple charges, which could result in decades in military prison and complete disgrace. The woman who had tried to save innocent lives now faced the destruction of everything she had worked to build. The final day of testimony arrived with an atmosphere of inevitable conviction hanging over the courtroom. Sarah's attorney had exhausted all legal options, and the prosecution seemed confident in their case. The judge prepared to give final instructions to the military panel who would decide Sarah's fate. Most observers expected a swift guilty verdict on all charges. Sarah sat quietly, mentally preparing herself for the prison sentence that seemed certain to follow. She had already begun thinking about how to protect her family from the continued shame and harassment that would come after her conviction. Her parents had aged visibly during the trial, and she worried about the impact on her brother's military career. The prosecution delivered a powerful closing argument, emphasizing Sarah's betrayal of military values and the danger she posed to national security. They portrayed her as someone whose ego and stubbornness had led her to fabricate evidence, rather than admit her mistakes. The prosecutor demanded the maximum sentence to send a clear message to other military personnel. Sarah's defense attorney made a final, desperate plea for understanding and mercy. He argued that Sarah was a dedicated officer who had simply tried to do her job correctly, even when it made her unpopular with superiors. However, his argument seemed weak against the mountain of evidence the prosecution had presented during the trial. As the military panel retired to deliberate, Sarah experienced a strange sense of calm. She had fought as hard as possible to clear her name, but the system seemed determined to destroy her. She closed her eyes and tried to find peace with the knowledge that she had acted according to her conscience, even if it cost her everything. The courtroom remained packed as reporters and observers waited for the verdict. Military officials whispered among themselves, many expressing satisfaction that the system was working to identify and punish potential security risks. Colonel Davidson sat in the gallery, his expression suggesting complete confidence in the outcome. Sarah's family huddled together in their seats, holding hands and praying for a miracle they knew was unlikely to come. Friends from her hometown had traveled to Washington to support her, despite knowing their association with her could damage their own reputations. Their loyalty meant everything to Sarah during her darkest hour. The deliberations stretched longer than expected, raising brief hopes that perhaps some panel members had doubts about the prosecution's case. However, Sarah's attorney cautioned against optimism, explaining that complex cases often required extended discussion even when the outcome was predetermined. The waiting became almost unbearable for everyone involved. Media speculation about the verdict dominated news coverage throughout the day. Military legal experts interviewed on television predicted guilty verdicts on most charges, with possible life imprisonment for the most serious offense. Some commentators suggested that Sarah's case would become a cautionary tale taught in military academies for years to come. As evening approached, word spread that the panel had reached a verdict and would announce it the following morning. Sarah spent what might be her last night of freedom with her family, trying to memorize their faces and voices before being taken away to military prison. The weight of injustice felt crushing, but she was determined to maintain her dignity until the end. That night, Sarah wrote letters to her family members, explaining her actions and asking them to remember her as someone who had tried to serve her country honorably. She also wrote a detailed account of her discoveries about the Syrian intelligence, hoping that someday the truth would emerge and vindicate her sacrifice. Tomorrow would bring either vindication or destruction, and she prepared herself for the worst possible outcome. The courtroom filled early as everyone gathered to hear the verdict that would seal Sarah's fate. She walked to her seat with quiet dignity, wearing her uniform for what might be the last time. The military panel filed in solemnly, their faces revealing nothing about their decision. The tension in the room was almost suffocating as the judge prepared to receive their verdict. Just as the panel foreman stood to announce the decision, a commotion erupted at the back of the courtroom. Military police officers rushed in, followed by several men in civilian clothes who carried themselves with unmistakable military bearing. Their arrival sent confused whispers through the gallery as people tried to understand what was happening. The lead civilian approached the bench and handed documents to the judge, who read them with increasing surprise. The man identified himself as Commander Jake Morrison from Naval Special Warfare Command, though he wore no visible rank or insignia. His presence immediately commanded attention, and even Colonel Davidson seemed startled by the unexpected development. Commander Morrison requested permission to address the court on urgent matters of national security. The judge, clearly uncertain about the unprecedented situation, granted the request after consulting with military attorneys. Morrison's bearing and authoritative manner suggested this was not a routine intervention, but something far more significant. Morrison began by explaining that his SEAL unit had been conducting a classified operation in Syria for the past 4 months. Their mission involved tracking the same terrorist cell that Sarah had been analyzing from her Pentagon desk. He paused dramatically before revealing that Sarah's intelligence reports had been absolutely accurate in every detail. The courtroom erupted in shocked murmurs as Morrison continued his testimony. He confirmed that the coordinates being targeted in drone strikes were indeed civilian areas, exactly as Sarah had reported. More disturbing, his team had discovered that someone within the Pentagon was deliberately providing false intelligence to allow high-value targets to escape while innocent families were killed. Colonel Davidson's face went pale as Morrison described how Sarah's accurate analysis had actually compromised a carefully planned counterintelligence operation. The SEALs had been using the false intelligence to track down the source of the leaks, and Sarah's persistent questioning had threatened to expose their investigation before they could identify all the conspirators involved. Morrison revealed that his unit had been monitoring the court-martial proceedings while simultaneously conducting their operation in Syria. They had wanted to intervene earlier but needed to complete their mission first. The timing of their arrival was not accidental. They had just captured the actual perpetrators of the intelligence manipulation Sarah had uncovered. The evidence Morrison presented was devastating to the prosecution's case. He showed classified intercepts proving that Colonel Davidson and several other officers had been selling intelligence to foreign operatives. Sarah's analysis had not only been correct but had actually helped expose a spy ring that had been operating within the Pentagon for over 2 years. Sarah sat in stunned silence as Morrison described how her work had ultimately led to the capture of 12 enemy operatives and prevented several planned terrorist attacks. Her persistence in questioning false intelligence had made her an unwitting ally in one of the most important counterterrorism operations in recent memory, even though she had no knowledge of the larger mission. The prosecution team scrambled to respond to Morrison's revelations, but their case had crumbled completely. Colonel Davidson was immediately taken into custody by military police as Morrison's team presented evidence of his treasonous activities. Other officers mentioned in the SEAL commander's testimony were also arrested on the spot. The judge called for an immediate recess to consult with higher authorities about the unprecedented situation. Sarah's attorney could hardly contain his excitement as he realized that not only would his client be vindicated, but she would likely be recognized as a hero whose dedication had helped expose serious national security threats. Morrison approached Sarah during the recess and thanked her personally for her courage in pursuing the truth, despite overwhelming pressure to remain silent. He explained that her actions had unknowingly provided crucial support to their operation and had ultimately saved countless innocent lives. The woman who had been branded a fraud was about to be revealed as a patriot of the highest order. When court reconvened, the atmosphere had completely changed. The judge announced that all charges against Sarah were being dropped immediately, and that she would be fully reinstated with an apology from the military justice system. The panel members who had been ready to convict her now looked embarrassed about their near participation in a massive injustice. Commander Morrison provided additional details about the counterintelligence operation that had vindicated Sarah. He explained that Colonel Davidson and his co-conspirators had been selling targeting information to terrorist networks, allowing them to evacuate personnel and equipment before strikes while ensuring that only civilians were harmed. The psychological warfare value of making America appear to target innocents had been worth millions to enemy operatives. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. Davidson had recruited several junior officers who needed money for various personal reasons, creating a network of informants throughout the intelligence community. They had been careful to mix accurate information with false data to avoid detection, but Sarah's meticulous analysis had spotted the patterns they thought were undetectable. Sarah's vindication extended beyond the courtroom as media outlets scrambled to correct their previous coverage. The reporters who had painted her as a traitor now competed to tell the story of her courage and dedication. Headlines transformed from accusations of fraud to celebrations of her heroism, though the damage to her reputation would take time to fully heal. The Pentagon held an emergency press conference to address the intelligence breach and Sarah's role in exposing it. Senior officials who had previously distanced themselves from her case now praised her analytical skills and dedication to duty. The military leadership promised a thorough review of security procedures to prevent similar infiltrations in the future. Sarah's family wept with relief and joy as they realized their daughter and sister would not only avoid prison but would likely receive commendations for her service. Her brother called from Afghanistan to express his pride and apologize for ever doubting her integrity. The hometown friends who had supported her throughout the ordeal felt vindicated in their loyalty. The investigation into Davidson's spy ring expanded rapidly as more evidence emerged from the Syrian operation. Financial records revealed payments totaling over $3 million to various conspirators over 2 years. The damage assessment showed that dozens of military operations had been compromised, resulting in the deaths of both American personnel and innocent civilians. Sarah met privately with Commander Morrison and his team to learn more about how her work had contributed to their success. She discovered that her reports had provided crucial confirmation of intelligence patterns they had suspected but couldn't prove. Her unwillingness to accept false information had ultimately saved the lives of hundreds of civilians who would have been targeted in future operations. The psychological impact of vindication was overwhelming for Sarah. Months of isolation, accusation, and despair suddenly gave way to recognition and respect. However, she struggled with anger about the injustice she had endured and the system that had been so quick to destroy her rather than investigate her legitimate concerns about intelligence accuracy. Military lawyers approached Sarah about filing charges against those who had orchestrated her prosecution based on false evidence. However, she chose to focus on returning to her work rather than seeking revenge. Her priority was ensuring that the intelligence reforms she had advocated would be implemented to prevent future civilian casualties. Sarah's security clearance was restored at an even higher level. Recognizing her proven loyalty and analytical abilities, she was offered several prestigious assignments, including positions with Commander Morrison's Special Operations Unit. The Pentagon leadership wanted to demonstrate their confidence in her abilities and their commitment to supporting officers who showed similar courage. The broader implications of Sarah's case began to emerge as Congress announced hearings into intelligence oversight and military justice procedures. Her experience had revealed serious flaws in how the system handled whistleblowers and investigated potential security breaches. Reforms would be necessary to ensure that future Sarah Martinez's would be protected rather than prosecuted for doing their jobs correctly. 6 months after her vindication, Sarah returned to her desk at the Pentagon with a new perspective on duty, courage, and the price of standing up for truth. Her experience had transformed her from a dedicated analyst into a symbol of integrity within the military intelligence community. Younger officers sought her advice about navigating ethical dilemmas, and senior leaders consulted her on reforms to prevent future security breaches. The spy ring prosecution proceeded swiftly as evidence continued to mount against Colonel Davidson and his co-conspirators. Davidson received a life sentence for treason, while his subordinates faced varying terms based on their level of involvement. The trials revealed the extent of damage caused by their betrayal, including the deaths of American soldiers whose positions had been compromised through sold intelligence. Sarah testified before Congress about her experience and the need for better protection of military personnel who report security concerns. Her articulate and passionate testimony helped convince lawmakers to pass new whistleblower protection legislation for the armed forces. The Sarah Martinez Act, as it became known, established clear procedures for investigating intelligence discrepancies and protecting those who report them. Commander Morrison's SEAL unit received numerous commendations for their Syrian operation, which had not only captured dangerous terrorists, but also exposed the Pentagon spy ring. Morrison maintained contact with Sarah, occasionally consulting with her on intelligence analysis for other special operations. Their professional relationship evolved into a deep mutual respect based on their shared commitment to protecting innocent lives. The media rehabilitation of Sarah's reputation was complete, with several news organizations apologizing for their earlier coverage and examining how they had been manipulated by false information from Davidson's network. Sarah gave carefully selected interviews to explain her experience and advocate for intelligence reform, but she avoided becoming a celebrity and focused on her professional responsibilities. Sarah's personal life slowly healed from the trauma of her ordeal. She reconnected with colleagues who had distanced themselves during her prosecution, though some relationships remained strained. New friendships formed with people who admired her courage, and she found unexpected peace in knowing that she had acted correctly despite enormous pressure to remain silent. The intelligence reforms implemented after Sarah's case fundamentally changed how the Pentagon handled analytical disagreements and security concerns. New oversight mechanisms ensured that officers could report discrepancies without fear of retaliation, and cross-verification procedures made it much harder for spy rings to operate undetected. Sarah's suffering had ultimately strengthened national security. Sarah chose to remain in her analytical role rather than accept promotion to administrative positions, believing she could serve best by continuing the detailed intelligence work she loved. Her reports now carried additional weight because of her proven track record, and her insights were valued at the highest levels of military planning. The woman who had been branded a fraud became one of the most trusted voices in intelligence analysis. The Syrian operation's success led to several follow-up missions that dismantled terrorist networks throughout the region. Sarah's continued analytical support proved invaluable in identifying patterns and connections that field operatives missed. Her work contributed to saving hundreds of civilian lives and capturing dozens of high-value targets who had previously escaped justice. Years later, as Sarah looked back on her experience, she recognized that her darkest moment had ultimately led to her greatest contribution to national security. The courage to speak truth to power had cost her nearly everything, but had ultimately saved countless innocent lives. Her story became required reading at military academies, inspiring new generations of officers to uphold integrity even when facing overwhelming opposition. The final vindication came when Sarah received the Distinguished Service Medal in a ceremony attended by the highest levels of military leadership. As she stood at attention while the citation was read, she thought about all the civilians whose lives had been saved because she refused to accept false intelligence. The woman they had branded a fraud had proved that sometimes the most patriotic act is refusing to follow orders when those orders are wrong.